Okay, Chef Joey is on board. All right, Chef Joey Prats is here. Hold on. Hi, Chef. Okay, so we're ready. Chef Joey Prats is here. Um, this person doesn't really need any further introduction. So again, I'm Grace Parazo. I'm the owner and founder of the Bailiwick Academy, and I'll be your host for tonight. And tonight we'll be having Chef Joey Prats as our guest speaker. So he will share with us on how to properly store our ingredients and how to determine a product shelf life. Okay, so I will just move my um, switch my camera to Chef Joey. Hold on.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
There you go. Hi, Chef.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
All
you.
right, great.
Okay, I just removed my face here. Hold on.
All right, so guys, I hope all of you can hear me. I hope all of you are doing well. You know, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and we're really all just praying that this would go away. But in the meantime, life has to go on, and I know most of you are just at home baking and waiting, so might as well use this time to be productive, right? Okay, so I was assigned the topics of how to store your food, food storage, and also shelf life. Okay, so before we start with the talk on food storage, I want to give you a little bit of information regarding food safety because the reason we are learning how to store food properly and the reason we're studying shelf life is because everything has to do with food safety. All right. So most of you have heard the words food safety. So what is food safety? Food safety has everything to do with avoiding foodborne illness because in our industry where customers buy our food, consume it almost on a daily basis, it's very important for us to have this social responsibility of providing clean sanitary food so that they will not get sick, meaning they will not contract foodborne illness. And for you guys to be able to understand this on a bigger picture, you have to understand that the main culprit, our enemy, that we have to not just eradicate because it's impossible to eradicate this enemy, how to minimize it is bacteria. And bacteria is everywhere. Okay, it's in the air we breathe, it's in the food that we eat, it's in our equipment, it's everywhere. Therefore, it is our duty, it is our mission to avoid and minimize this threat because we don't want to get sued by our customers. And unfortunately, there are many of those who will take opportunity on this and make it difficult for us, no? You know naman, here in the Philippines, especially here in the Philippines, where konting problems on tummy trouble and all, they'll make it a big issue and they'll try to extort money from you. So that's something you don't want to happen. So when it comes to bacteria, you have to understand first how bacteria grows. Okay, because if you understand how bacteria grows, then you will be able to minimize their growth. You will be able to almost eradicate their presence in your kitchen, and you will learn how to properly store your food so that they don't get infected and contaminated with bacteria. All right. There are 6 conditions for bacterial growth. Okay, take this down. I know this is going to be recorded, and you can always just you know watch this over and over again. But if you have a pen and a paper, this will be a good time for you to take notes. So the number one, just remember this: Fatt Fatom, fatom. Okay, no, not phantom, fatom. F meaning food. A meaning acidity or alkalinity. T for time. Another T for temperature. O for oxygen. And M for moisture. All right. So food, when it comes to food, this is the first condition for bacterial growth. Bacteria will consume everything we consume, meaning our food is their food. So you got to be careful, especially when you deal with, and this is common sense, okay? When you deal with dairy products, when you deal with meats, chicken, fish, seafood, all these things, these are what we call potentially hazardous food because bacteria grows in on it and bacteria multiplies on it at exponential rates. Okay, that's food. Next, acidity or alkalinity. Who among you remembers your high school um, chemistry? Do you remember the litmus paper? Litmus paper test? Okay, di ba? If it's acidic, turns pink. If it's alkaline, it turns blue. So here's the rule for foods. Okay, the more acidic it is, and the more alkaline it is, the less chances of bacteria growing, and the safer it is. Don't you wonder? And when I was a kid, I used to wonder this. Whenever my school had field trips, our teachers would tell us to, let's say, what food to bring. We would bring adobo, and the teacher would say, "We'll bring adobo because it's very high in acid because there's vinegar in it, and that's the reason why adobo can last like a day or two without refrigeration." And I've always wondered, you know, about that. And I was like grade 1 or grade 2 at that time. So as I got older, I understood better that when something is very acidic, when something has a lot of, let's say, lemon juice or vinegar, then it will last longer. It will have less chances of bacterial growth. So just remember that. Okay? The closer it is to a neutral pH, then the more, uh, excuse me, the more in danger you will be. All right? So acidic, more alkaline, the better. All right. T. The 2-letter T's, time and temperature, go hand in hand. Okay? Why? Because in the food industry, we have a rule. All right? The rule is if anything, any food item is allowed to sit at room temperature for 4 hours, then we discard the food. Anything that is within room temperature for 4 hours has to be thrown away, even if it's still good. Okay, there's a reason for that. Bacteria grows at exponential rates when it is at a certain window of temperature. Now, this window of temperature is known as the FDZ, the food danger zone. Okay, and what is this window of temperature? This is between 5 degrees Celsius and 60 degrees Celsius. 5 to 60. Meaning, if your food is within this range of temperature, then it is in danger of not just contracting bacteria, but it is in danger of being infested with a tremendous amount of bacteria after 4 hours or by the fourth hour. All right? So, your goal as a food service professional, because I look upon you now, all of you, the Bailiwickers, as food service professional, because we are in this together. You are preparing food on a daily basis, and you have to remember your mission is to keep foods away from this temperature window, 5 to 60. Okay, meaning your refrigerator has to be below 5 degrees. That's why when you guys always, you message me, I always tell you, make sure your fridge is between 2 to 4 Celsius. Buy a thermometer, stick it inside your fridge, leave it there. What kind of thermometer? Of course, a refrigerator thermometer. There is such a thing. And there's also such a thing as a freezer thermometer. All right? So later we'll talk more about that when we are in the main topic of food storage. All right. So time, remember 4 hours is the magic number. And temperature, 5 to 60, the food danger zone. These two, time and temperature, they work hand in hand. All right. Next, O. O stands for oxygen. Now, there are two types of bacteria. The first one we call aerobic bacteria. Okay? When you say aerobic bacteria, that means they require oxygen to grow. The second type is anaerobic. Anaerobic bacteria does not require oxygen to grow. Now, regardless of whether they are aerobic or anaerobic, bacteria will grow in an atmosphere that is filled with oxygen. And we as human beings live in an atmosphere that is oxygen rich. So we have to be very, very, how do you call this, conscious about that. Okay, so when you are in your kitchen and all your food items, your ingredients are all laid out on your work table, you have to be very conscious that the very air that we breathe is a source of basically food for bacteria because they require that. Most bacteria require that to live. Okay, and lastly, M, moisture. Okay, the more moist an environment is, the faster bacteria will grow. Remember that. So for an ingredient that has moisture, for example, you've got dairy products, no, cheeses, butter, cream, all of this. These ingredients are more prevalent when it comes to bacterial growth. Dry ones like rice, sugar, flour, not as much, but you still have to store them properly and carefully. Okay, those are the 6 conditions for bacterial growth. Now, you as a food server, you have basically 3 missions. First, you have to, number 1, keep bacteria from spreading. Number 2, stop bacteria from growing. And number 3, kill bacteria. All right, how do you do this? Keep bacteria from spreading. Mainly what we are concerned about here is contamination. And it's very timely that we are all in a pandemic because here, the government, whether you're in the Philippines or whether you're anywhere in the world, governments of the world are talking about social distancing. They're talking about wearing masks and all of these things because part of keeping bacteria or viruses from spreading is not allowing them to contaminate or to touch other beings that will allow for these bacteria and viruses to grow. Therefore, in the food service industry, we must we must be very watchful that we do not cross contaminate. Okay, cross contamination. That's the word that you should be really focusing on. So, meaning, for example, when you're cutting chicken to make our chicken empanadas, our thing, you don't use the same cutting board and you don't use the same knife to cut the vegetables in that recipe. You should have, conveniently, or dapat, you should have a separate knife for vegetables, a separate cutting board for vegetables, and if you don't have separate cutting board, because you can say, okay, I'm going to have what, 6 or 8 cutting boards or 6 to 8 knives, that's not practical. The least you can do is to wash, soap, sanitize the cutting board and the knife before you engage in cutting another ingredient. That way you can be sure that there is no cross contamination. Okay? And this is very important for you guys. Second, we stop bacteria from growing. And to do this, how do you stop bacteria from growing? You take away or you remove from the equation, from the bacteria, the conditions that will allow it to grow and proliferate. And we talked about how many? 6, right? Fathom. So make sure that fathom, the 6 conditions for bacterial growth, do not exist so that bacteria will not grow. Now you're going to say, well, it's impossible to remove all 6. Remove as much as you can. Keep your food or ingredients away from the food danger zone, the temperature range we talked about. Okay? Make sure they're refrigerated if the ingredient has to be refrigerated. Make sure they're stored well wrapped and airtight if they have to be stored that way. So it is your job to be very, very conscious. You have to be aware because food, when you get into food, especially food business, it is your responsibility to know the most important things that will protect your customers and yourselves because basically in the end you're trying to protect yourself. Okay, and if you can't keep bacteria from spreading and you can't stop bacteria from growing, well, you can do number 3, kill bacteria. And when we say kill bacteria, the way to do this is of course by subjecting the food item containing the bacteria in conditions wherein the bacteria will not survive, which means what? Temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius. That's why when kaming mga chefs, no, when we're in our kitchen and we have pots on the stove, it's very important that we have thermometer also. Thermometers, plural, we have a lot because each pot has to have its own thermometer. We have to make sure that each food item has to remain above 60 degrees Celsius. That's very important. Okay? And that's why also you will notice that most chef's uniform, like the one I have here, see, that's 2 pockets here. 2 pockets. One for the pen and one for the thermometer. We are required when we work in a food service establishment to carry a thermometer everywhere I go and we poke everything. Okay, that's the way to go. All right? So do you understand now the importance of food safety in the kitchen? So you now know, you are now armed with the conditions for bacterial growth, and you're also armed with the knowledge on how to protect against bacteria. That's the basic, knowledge that I want you to know, because by knowing what I just explained to you, you are now ready to understand how to properly store your food. All right? Now, let's talk about the main topic, which is food ingredients. Now, basically, when we talk about storage, 3 things that will pop in your head. Number one is your pantry. Second will be your refrigerator. Third will be your freezer, because those are the three uh, places where you would store your food, right? Your pantry, your fridge, and your freezer. Now, I already have mentioned earlier that your freezer has to be at minus 18 degrees Celsius. Okay, minus 18. Now, stick a freezer thermometer inside your freezer. Look at the temperature. If it's above minus 18, let's say it's minus 16, minus 15, minus 14, that means your freezer is not cold enough. And everything that you put there will be compromised. Okay? When you buy a frozen food and it says expiration in 6 months, that has been tested. It says, kunyari, for example, no, keep frozen to last 6 months. That means it has been tested in an environment of minus 18 for 6 months. But if your freezer is above minus 18, as I mentioned, minus 15, minus 14, it's still, you look at your items, they're still frozen. But those 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, they mean a lot when it comes to shelf life. You see, the reason Miss Grace assigned me the topics of food storage and shelf life is because they go hand in hand. Sorry. Shelf life is affected by proper storage, or I should say improper storage. So for your freezer, it's minus 18. For your fridge or your refrigerator, it has to be 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And your pantry has to be anywhere between 15 to a maximum of 27 degrees Celsius. All right. All right. Guys, excuse me. Give me like 10 seconds. Let me just get something. Okay. Hang on. All right. Okay. So those are the three areas that you really have to watch. Pantry, 15 degrees Celsius up to 27 degrees Celsius. Fridge, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And your freezer, minus 18. If your freezer can go below minus 18, like minus 30, for example, wow. Whatever your frozen food item says 6 months frozen, that will last longer. Because the colder it is, the longer your food items will last. Now, sometimes it takes common sense to determine whether an item has to be refrigerated, frozen, or left in the pantry. Now, for the dry ingredients, for us bakers, we have a lot of ingredients, right? We have, you know, like a whole grocery of ingredients. And most of the questions I get from you guys are all ingredient related. How to store not just ingredients, but also finished products. But we'll talk about that later. How to store flour, for example. How to store cocoa powder. Most especially leaveners like yeast, baking powder. Now, the reason I mentioned your pantry having a temperature range of 15 degrees Celsius up to 27 degrees Celsius because here in Manila or in the Philippines, room temperature is not room temperature. And I've always said this in all of my online classes, right? When I say room temperature, we're talking about 20 degrees Celsius. Okay? That's ideal. But actually, 15 to 27 is considered room temperature. Unfortunately, here in our country, most of the time, even if it's not summer, most of the time our temperature is above 30 degrees Celsius. And that's very dangerous for ingredients and even finished products because when you put something in an environment that's above 30 degrees Celsius, don't expect anything to last long. Your yeast, for example, if it says it expires in, let's say, 6 months, airtight jar, you put it above 30 degrees Celsius, it will not last that time. Hence, when you bake anything that's like a bread product, use that kind of yeast. After, let's say, a month of being in a temperature above 30 degrees, you're going to start wondering and say, bakit hindi umalsa yung bread? And then you message me and say, Chef, hindi umalsa yung bread, look. And that's why I ask you, how do you store your yeast? All right? So yeast and even baking powder, if you can, place them in a super, super airtight. When I say airtight, I really mean airtight container. The container has to be dry, clean, and sanitized. Okay, so wash it. After washing it, have a pot of boiling water. Submerge it in boiling water for about 10 or 15 minutes. And after that, you remove it, put it on a baking tray with a piece of cloth to absorb the water. And then you let it air dry. Don't wipe it with a cloth. Let it air dry until it's completely dry. And you have a dry, sanitized container where you can store your yeast and your baking powder and your baking soda. All right? So you can store your yeast and baking powder, baking soda in the fridge as long as it's airtight and moisture cannot get into it. For other ingredients like flour, sugar, cocoa powder, it's all right to store it in the pantry if your temperature is above 30 degrees Celsius. That's fine, but just take note of the expiration date. If it says 6 months, cut that in half, 3 months. That's your shelf life if you store it in an environment that's above 30 degrees. So it's really about, because I can't expect naman everybody to have an air-conditioned kitchen or to have an air-conditioned pantry because, hey, it's expensive to have your kitchen, air-conditioned and all. But um, if you know these rules and all the rules, if you notice, they all center around temperature. If you know these rules, it will be easy for you to figure out how and where to store your food items. Okay, so cocoa powder, you've got flour, you've got sugar, rice, you've got pasta, all dry ingredients, even peanut butter, um, jams, jellies. But here's the rule for jarred products, no? Most jarred products, they can be stored in your pantry, but once they're open, you have to refrigerate them. It's very important. Because why? When the jars come out of the factory, they were, listen to this term, hermetically sealed. All right? Hermetically sealed, meaning they were sealed in conditions wherein the oxygen was removed from inside the jar and they were sealed airtight, meaning air cannot enter the jar. And when there's no oxygen, there's no air, most bacteria cannot grow. But once you open it, you allow air to enter. And when that happens, your food item is now prone to bacterial growth and spoilage. And that's why you have to refrigerate them. Now, a good rule would be for you guys to look at the packaging of whatever ingredients. All right? It will tell you how to store that particular ingredient. So if it says refrigerate, refrigerate. If it says, if it doesn't say anything, then the pantry is the way to go. Also, as a rule of thumb, when you store things in your pantry, make sure, and this is a rule in the food service industry, do not store anything within 6 inches from the floor. All right. Make sure everything is at least 6 inches from the floor. That's a rule. Why? For obvious reasons. You've got rodents or rats, you've got cockroaches, you've got insects. All right. Also, when you clean, you've got dust and all other dirty, dirt or dirt materials that will be flying onto your food. So you have to keep them above floor level, right? Now, One of the most common mistakes that a lot of you guys have been committing, and I'm sure most of you are not yet aware of this, is that eggs have to be refrigerated at all times. Most markets, and I'm talking about wet markets, you buy your eggs from there, everything's just laid out in the open. It's very dangerous. That's why professionals never buy their eggs from wet markets. First of all, you never know how long they've been sitting on the counter or how they've been handled. Very important for you if you are a big baker, and I'm talking about somebody who's, into business and you're doing a lot of baking and buying a lot of ingredients, I mean in bulk. Very important for you to establish a good supplier for your eggs. Okay? If not, if you are a small baker, then get them from the supermarket because you can choose the eggs that have clean shells. Okay, that's very important. Um, Anything that is potentially hazardous. I mentioned this earlier, PHF, potentially hazardous foods like meats, fish, poultry, dairy products, these all have to be refrigerated. All right? So these are common sense. These are common sense rules, which all of us must know before we start into the food service industry. All right. Now, let's talk about shelf life because, as I mentioned earlier, proper storage and shelf life go together. Now, I don't know how to Miss Grace, if you're there, if you can hear me. I don't know how to do this. I'm seeing some. I see chat boxes on the right. Am I supposed to later on? No, when we have our question and answer, is this where I read the questions and then answer? It's just like a going FB live. Is that how it is? Yeah. All right. Got it. Okay. Very good. All right. So we'll talk about we'll talk about shelf life. Now, a lot of you have this question, Chef, gaano katagal ito pwede mag-last? Okay, for example, the empanadas. What's the shelf life of empanadas? What's the shelf life of ensaimadas? And those are very good questions, huh? Because most of your customers will ask you the same questions. And they expect answers from you, answers that are true, answers that have been tested. So guessing game is not allowed when you declare shelf life. And I cannot stress this enough that when we declare shelf life, we have to play safe. Because when you make a declaration, then they will hold you uh, liable for this and responsible for this. So the general rule is when you talk about cakes with frostings, refrigerated cakes, I mean. So the refrigerator shelf life is maximum 5 days. Okay, doesn't mean after 5 days they're no longer good. They can still be eaten, but after the fifth day, they no longer taste fresh. They would dry up, and if they have whipped cream frosting, for example, you will see the frosting cracking up, and those are signs that doesn't mean they're no longer edible, but they are no longer new. They're no longer fresh. So 5 days is the maximum. Kami in the industry, especially when I worked sa hotels, for refrigerator cakes, we always say 2 days. 2 days. You make it on a Monday. We display it on a Tuesday. Okay, so the customer would buy it on a Tuesday, and we tell them 2 days. So Wednesday, they have to be consumed by Wednesday. Does this mean that the cake is no longer good after Wednesday? Of course not. But they will be good as freshly baked until Wednesday. So make sure your customers know that. Okay. For pies, the same thing. 5 days refrigerated. Now here's the thing. A lot of you have been asking me, Chef, pwede bang Pwede bang room temperature? Okay. The rule is if it contains any potentially hazardous ingredients, eggs, poultry, the ones I mentioned earlier, dairy products like cream, butter, cheese, um, pork, fish, chicken, for our empanadas, they cannot be left at room temperature. As in, it's a no-no. You can't, because these potentially hazardous ingredients are magnets for bacteria. And even if they taste okay the following day, they could already have a lot of bacteria growing on them. And even if they taste good, once you ingest them, your stomach contains a lot of conditions, good conditions for bacterial growth. And once the bacteria grows rapidly in our tummies, they could start giving you what we call foodborne illness. So it's very important for you to know that. All right. Cookies are. I love cookies. I love cookies, and cookies are what we call. They also are 2 day. We call them 2 day items because cookies stale fast. After the second day, they no longer taste fresh. Have you noticed that? You make a good chocolate chip cookie. They're so good, moist and chewy on the first day. The second day, they're still okay, not fantastic, not as fantastic as the first day. But on the third day, you will notice that they begin to become crumbly. And then you say, what happened to this? They staled. Staling is a process wherein once a baked product comes out of the oven and oxygen touches it, they start to they start on their journey to spoilage. In the most simplest terms, that's what happens. All right. And it's important for you guys to to know that and to prevent that from happening. So like for the ensaimadas, don't allow your ensaimadas to just from coming out of the oven to just stay there for hours and hours on end. For us here in my school and bake shop, once the ensaimadas come out of the oven, we cool it for about an hour, and then we stick a thermometer inside the ensaimada. Once it reaches 20 degrees Celsius, it goes to the finishing department where they get their buttercream toppings and their cheeses, and then they're wrapped as fast as we can. And we make anywhere from 800 to 1,200 pieces a day. And we have 4 people in the finishing department to do that. And it's very important for us to do this as fast as we can, because the longer your baked products stay in open air, the faster they will dry up and stale. So that's the word that you should use, stale, staling. All right. Cookies, pies, and cakes. Next, empanadas. Empanadas, once they're cool, technically speaking, they have to be refrigerated right away. Okay, because sabi nga natin we have a 4-hour rule, no? Pero practical wise, especially here in our country, the Philippines, they can last the whole day in room temperature. As in 24 hours, they still are good. They're not spoiled. Okay, but again, if you're going to sell your products, don't take the risk. Don't take the risk. Always make sure they go into your refrigerator. It's very easy to warm them, right? Just warm them up. And like in a toaster oven or in your big oven or in a microwave oven. But for empanadas, of course, we want to warm them up in a toaster oven to get that crunchy, flaky crust. All right. And then for what else? Of course, for ice cream, naman, di ba, na proper storage is freezer. And the lower your temperature in your freezer is, if you can achieve minus 18 or lower, the longer your ice cream will last in your freezer. But if your freezer is not up to standards when it comes to temperature, you're going to know this. And I'm sure this has happened to most of you. You open the ice cream tub and you say, bakit may ice crystal sa loob? Bakit? That's a sign that your freezer is not cold enough. Okay, so turn up the dial, bring it to full blast if you have to. And most of you guys, kasi you're making tipid, of course, I know that. Most of us are naman, we're not, people who would waste electricity. We want to save. So we turn it as low as possible to save energy. But then again, if it destroys your food, then what's the point, right? There. Okay. So when you store your ingredients or even your finished products, please put some sensibility into it. Again, as I said, most of these are common sense, but sometimes even the smartest of us, uh, common sense eludes us, especially when it comes to finished product and we don't know anything about these things. Okay, so if you have any questions, I'm being very, very watchful of the time because I'm given 1 hour here. Okay, and it's already 10:08. We started at 9:30, so I have 20 minutes, and I want to give enough time for you guys to be able to ask as much questions as you can, and I'll answer them as you know as well as I can to enlighten you guys, because this is a once in a blue moon kind of thing, this webinar, and I'm really very thrilled to be here with you guys. All right, can I start answering questions? Oh, I see a very familiar name here. Hang on. Okay, start with Miss Grace. Paano po sa empanada kung i-deliver ko after cooking? All right. When it comes to empanadas or even donuts, we encourage our customers to give us leeway when ordering, because we want to deliver them as much as possible right after cooking, because that's when it's the most tender and melt in the mouth and flaky. So when the empanadas come out of the fry pan, we put them on baking trays, large trays with kitchen towels, paper napkins, we call them paper napkins, and we let the oil drain. Make sure you let the oil drain, and then after like a minute or two, baliktarin yung empanadas so that both sides madrain yung oil. The less oil there is in the empanadas after cooking, the longer it will last na flaky and tender and melt in the mouth. All right? So, pagkatapos noon, we pack them as fast as we can in little what we call this glassine envelopes, which we buy from baking supply stores, and then we put them in boxes, and then we deliver. Of course, here we use Lala Move or we use Grab Express, no? And then we inform our customers that they're newly cooked and they should be eaten or consumed within 48 hours. And if they can consume them within the first day, they should refrigerate and reheat. We tell them that they're not supposed to last more than 2 days, but if it will last more than 2 days, then please don't expect that they will be as good as the first and second day. Okay. Now, most bake shops here, like for example, Mary Grace, when you buy a cake from them, they'll tell you, sir, travel time po niyan is like 2 hours maximum. Kailangan po hindi mainit, kailangan nasa aircon yan. Tapos consume within 1 or 2 days. They tell you that because it's their responsibility to make sure na when you eat their cake, na it's at the peak condition. Because otherwise you'll be disappointed and not go back to them. All right, we've got Regina Gelsana. How to extend shelf life of baked goods. Now, when it comes to breads or even cakes, there are those that put extenders or they put what we call preservatives to extend shelf life. I'm not one of those people. I do not like to buy anything that has preservatives in them. I believe that baked products should be freshly baked every day. And this is something that I really cannot understand among us Filipinos. Because when it comes to pandesal, you see people lining up in bakeries or panaderias at 5 a.m. to get their pandesal. And they won't buy plenty. They'll buy just enough for the day, specifically for breakfast. And then they will come back the following morning at 5 a.m. making pila because they want to get that bagong luto from the pugon pandesal where it's crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Okay. But when it comes to other things, they would look for something that would last like 2 weeks or a month. And I said, why can't you guys look for the same thing in these other pastries that you buy, the same thing as with the pandesal. You want freshness, diba? So tell your customers, ma'am, I'm sorry, our products do not last long because we don't put preservatives in them. We are an artisan bake shop. When you say artisan bake shop, number one, all the recipes are made in small batches. Okay. Pag sinabi natin artisan, ito yun. Pag tinanong kayo ng customers, what's artisan? Artisan is when your recipes are made in small batches. They are made by hand. So they are handcrafted. They do not use any preservatives, extenders, or anything that would extend the shelf life beyond the natural life of that baked product. And number four, they should be done or made using traditional techniques, okay, and procedures and natural ingredients. They should not contain artificial ingredients. Okay, if your baked product or your recipe meets the four criteria, then you can tell your customers that you are an artisan bake shop. Okay, everything is baked fresh every single day. So me, I do not like to use extenders or preservatives to extend the shelf life of baked products. Now, other chefs would be okay with this, and that's fine. You know, I respect naman the opinions and the beliefs of other people, but not for me because I really don't like, unfresh baked products. All right, next. Can you store your instant yeast in the freezer? From Maida Bautista. Maida, you can definitely store your yeast in the freezer. In fact, I store my yeast in the freezer. I put it in a jar that's been cleaned, dried, and sanitized. And then I put first a sheet of plastic wrap or cling wrap on the top, on the mouth of the jar before I seal it with the cap. Okay, and then I wrap the whole jar with cling wrap again to make sure no moisture gets in. And this is a good way to extend the shelf life of your yeast. So whether you're using instant yeast or active dry yeast, this is the way to store them. Now, just to segue a little bit, what is the difference between active dry yeast and instant yeast? Because I also get a lot of questions about this. When you say instant yeast, this is the very fine, almost powder-like yeast. No? This is what we call a third generation yeast because the first generation is the fresh compressed yeast. Okay, they look like blocks of butter, but they're colored gray. That's what our lolos and grand lolos used before the war. Okay, and then our moms would use the active dry yeast, which is basically dry yeast also, and it has to be bloomed in a little bit of water and activated. Okay, a little bit of warm water with a little bit of sugar, and then once it bubbles up and foams up, then we proceed with the procedure of the recipe. Instant yeast is the third generation. It's the latest type of yeast wherein you don't have to activate it. It goes straight into the dry ingredients. In the States, this is known as rapid rice yeast. So if you see that rapid rice yeast, that means instant yeast. And the reason they call it rapid rice is mabilis siya mag-rise. So if you're going to use, how do you call this, active dry yeast, and a good guideline would be you can use the same amount of yeast as instant yeast, but you just have to watch the rising of the dough because for instant yeast, they rise faster. That's why professionals use less instant yeast than active dry yeast. Okay, when you do bulk baking, like when you do like sacks by flour, and you have like a 50-kilogram mixer, the rule is very simple for us professionals. Whatever the weight of the flour, the yeast is 1% the weight of the flour when it comes to instant yeast, 2% kapag active dry yeast, tapos 3% when it comes to compressed or fresh yeast. So it's 1, 2, 3. Very easy for us to remember. No? But our recipes, since they're very small, like my recipes are like 500 grams, 700 grams of flour, we amp up the yeast to 2%, even if it's instant yeast, because such a small batch, and we are making habol also the time by which the dough rises. Okay? So if you have any questions, you can always PM me. And please PM me sa personal account ko, not sa school page, because it's easier for me to access the personal account. And with the messages, of course, that I get on a daily basis, I get between 200 to 300 messages. Very easy for me to do voice messages. That's why I always do voice messages, right? All right. Next, do we need to wash the eggs before we put inside the fridge? If the shells are clean, there's no need. But if they are soiled, okay, if you see a lot of dirt particles on them, it's a very good idea to just rinse it quickly and wipe them dry before putting them in the fridge, because you don't want any dirt to get into your fridge. Again, that's a rule of thumb. What is the best way of storing nuts? Okay, listen to this. Listen carefully. You buy nuts, right, from your baking supply store. Whether you're buying 500 grams, 5 kilos, 10 kilos, it does not matter. Once you get home, the very first thing you do to take your nuts, remove them from the plastic bags, put them on a baking sheet, and you toast it for 15 minutes at 180 degrees Celsius. That's the first thing you do, even if you're not baking. Okay? Toast all the nuts in your oven, 15 minutes, 180 Celsius. And then once they cool, you want the nuts to be light brown, lightly brown, because you want to. The reason we're toasting is, number one, to extend the shelf life of the nuts. Second, so that the oils will be drawn out and the nuts would have a better flavor. And also, so that rancidity does not set in. When say rancidity, yung sa Tagalog, it's maanta. You don't want that. So toast. Once they cool, pack them. Kami, we use big plastic containers like the Mega Box. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Parang ganon, but they're not Mega Box eh. Kasi yung the containers have a parang may rubber around the lids so that it's more airtight. Okay, and then we put them in the freezer if we're not baking frequently. So you store your nuts in the freezer, but they're toasted na. Okay, toast before you store, so that anytime you need to bake, your nuts are ready to go. You don't have to toast them anymore, and they're toasted uniformly. Okay. Now, if you live in a cold country, is it okay po ba to keep the eggs on room air or maybe room temperature? Well, how cold is your country? Remember, eggs, the shelf life of eggs will be cut by 50% if you store it in room temperature or in your pantry. But if you are baking frequently, then you can store them within 15 to 27 degrees Celsius for like 3 to 5 days, the maximum. After 5 days, don't use it anymore. Okay, so 5 days at 15 to 27 Celsius, fine. But still better sana if you can refrigerate it, diba? How long can we store homemade caramel syrup? Oh, I love caramel syrup. Okay, refrigerated, airtight lid, 1 month, 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. Caramel syrup does not spoil quickly. If your jar is clean, dry, and sanitized, wow, baka more than 6 weeks pa eh. Pero to be safe, 1 month. All right. Can we reuse oil? How to store used ingredients like oil used in frying? All right. Oil. When I cost my donuts, kasama yung costing ng oil to be used once. Because technically, if you have a very sharp tongue, you'll be able to taste food items that were cooked in oil that's not fresh. Oil has the tendency of absorbing the flavor and the odor of whatever you're frying, and then keep it within itself, so that when you fry using the same oil, that gets into the new batch of food you're frying. But having said that, you can actually clean your oil before you store it. So kunyari, nag-fry kayo ng donuts. After one batch of donuts, you see that the oil is still okay. You get a potato, just one potato, peel it, cut it into small pieces, and then when turn up the heat. When your oil is hot already, 180, 190, you put the potatoes in, fry it, and the potatoes tend to absorb all the odor and the flavor in your oil. Okay? So don't expect your oil to be magically clean. Like if it's already light brown, it will turn white. No. It will just remove the odor and the flavor. So after that, you remove the potatoes, you make salad the oil, you strain it using a cheesecloth to catch all the what do you call that, solid particles, and then you can store it airtight again, room temperature. Okay, room temperature. and then you can reuse it. But as much as possible, when you fry your like donuts, for example, kami kasi when we get donuts, like we get hundreds of orders, and we have a fryer. So we were able to like for 2 gallons of oil, we can fry about 150 donuts with that because we keep the temperature of the oil naman at a certain level, so the oil doesn't burn. All right. So there. Uh, Chef, for cake covered in fondant, how long can it be stored under room temperature? Well, depends on the cake, depends on the frosting under the fondant. Pero if you're using a dense cake like a butter or pound cake, which I recommend, um, and you're using a buttercream or a ganache, then you can store it in room temperature for about 48 hours maximum. But again, when you say room temperature, I'm talking about 15 degrees, 20 degrees. So nothing above uh, 20 degrees. Air conditioned room. Okay. If you don't have an air conditioned room, nako, that's going to be a problem. Okay. So how about milk? Once open, how long is the shelf life? Milk, once you open I assume you're talking about the UHT, no? Yung Tetra Brick na ganyan. Once you open, put it in your ref, mga 3 days. 3 days. If your ref naman is at 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, hanggang mga 4 days kaya niya eh. Okay, but as much as possible, consume within 3 days. Okay, for cream, the same thing. Whipping cream, 3 days after you open it. Okay, how about chocolate? Ooh, good question. Who's this? Mia. No last name. Mia. You're like Cher. Okay, one name only. Okay, Mia. She says, especially chocolate pellets or chocolate chips, will it be okay to put them inside the ref? Considering it's too hot here in the Philippines, sometimes they end up melting or clumping all together because of the heat. All right. For us, chocolate chips, we store in the ref. No problem because we don't melt chocolate chips. So we want the chocolate chips to be cold and hard because when you mix it with the cookie dough, you don't want the chocolate to be soft because they will melt, and then your dough, instead of being white, it will turn dark, it will turn brown. So you really want the chocolate to be cold and hard. But for chocolate that you will use for melting, to be melted, like for example you're going to make ganache or you're going to make chocolate decorations, unfortunately, you really have to store your chocolate between 15 degrees Celsius to 27 degrees Celsius maximum. So here in the Philippines, since our temperature is above 30 degrees, nako, they will really clump up. And you really have to choose the lesser of two evils. Because if you refrigerate that, then you'll have problems when you make your ganache or when you melt it for your chocolate decorations. Because once chocolate absorbs moisture, kahit na one microscopic drop, mamumuo yan. That pamumuo is called seizing. Okay, nagsiseize yung chocolate mo or tumitigas. So you don't want that to happen. But again, sabi ko nga, lesser of two evils. Mamimili ka, either mag-melt yung chocolate mo or um, mag-absorb ng moisture, which is hindi mo na magagamit yung chocolate mo. So for me, ang advice ko is, number one, don't buy too much chocolate more than you could use within a week. Kasi pag nag-melt yung chocolate mo at nag-separate yung butter, yung cocoa butter niya, which is the fat of the chocolate, it also affects the quality of the chocolate. So as much as possible, try to store it within that temperature range. No? Okay, did I answer your question? See, Faith, Chef, if we mass produce frozen uncooked empanada, should the pack be dehydrated, and is it okay to egg wash it? Okay, when you mass produce empanadas, you put the filling. Well, first of all, let me give you a secret, a technique. Kasi kami, we mass produce empanadas. So we make the dough. For example, morning, one of my bakers makes the dough. He makes dough good for, let's say, 500 empanadas. Okay. And then, he would separate that into portions na, if I'm not mistaken, parang 1 kilo by kilo yan eh. And then, nirarap niya sa cling wrap, bawat 1 kilo. And then he would refrigerate. Kasi di ba yung empanada natin needs to be refrigerated, the dough. So, in the afternoon, he would start rolling up the doughs and then cutting it into circles. Once na makat niya into circles, he has a lot of trays, nakapile up na yung trays niya. And then meron siyang cling wrap, lined with cling wrap. Lalagay niya yung circles of dough doon. And then, one layer lang, and then parchment on top. And then another layer of rounds of or circles of dough, and then parchment. So, if I'm not mistaken, parang 5 layers yun, ano? So, dough parchment, dough parchment, dough parchment. And then, babalutin niya yung buong tray na yun with cling wrap and then refrigerate it. All right. So, by the end of the day, he would have done 500 circles of dough, good for 500 empanadas. The following day is the filling day. So, lalagyan niya ng palaman yon, and then isiseal na niya yung empanadas, and then they're placed on trays again with parchment, and then it goes straight to the freezer. All right. Our freezer are set at minus 28 kasi gusto namin blast freezer temperature. So I was able to get Electrolux, the big ones, and then meron siyang temperature control sa labas. So we're able to set at minus 28. And then if we freeze na namin yung filled empanadas, but we never ever egg wash them. You only egg wash them right before baking. Kasi pag in-egg wash mo na yan, magiging sticky yung egg wash. You won't be able to pack them cleanly. Okay? So after that, at least 4 hours dun sa aming freezer or blast freezer, and then we pack them na in plastic bags kasi solid as a rock na yun, di ba? Matigas na yun parang bato. So we put them in plastic bags, 12 per plastic bags, and a lot of our customers buy them frozen. So they bake it or they fry it themselves, which is convenient kasi di ba, for if it's for baon, for example, for the kids, you want them freshly baked or freshly fried the same day that your kids will take them to school. So most of our customers buy them frozen. But for those who buy them cooked, then from the freezer, we just put them on trays, tanggalin sa plastic. We thaw them for about 15 or 20 minutes. And once they're no longer hard as a rock, then it goes to the frying department. They fry. Okay? So don't egg wash before freezing. All right. Chef, yung yeast stored in the fridge but not in a tight container. Is that okay? No. Tight container, airtight. Okay? Make sure they're airtight. Kasi pag ang kalaban ng yeast is, number one is heat and moisture. Yun yung nag-activate sa yeast. So kung pasukin ng moisture, kasi hindi airtight yung jar, then your yeast will lose potency. Then you're going to realize, bakit hindi nag-rise yung dough ko? Ayan, because pinasok ng moisture. Nawala ng, how do you call that? Nawala ng power ang yeast. Alright, sa pandesal, chef, sabi ni Janelle Nocom, pwede po ba ako gumawa ng dough sa gabi? Then bake na lang po in the next morning. Okay. Sa bread recipes, there are doughs that were designed to be baked right after kneading and fermentation and proofing. But there are doughs that benefit from being retarded. Yun yung tawag natin, ha? Yung pag yung dough nilalagay sa fridge overnight, nire-retard natin. Okay. Merong mga recipes na made for retardation, merong for straight baking. Pero, most recipes naman, kahit na made for straight baking, pwede ninyong i-alter yung procedure niya para ma-accommodate yung retardation. So, ganitong gawin ninyo. First of all, after kneading or mixing in your mixer, di ba? Make sure you don't use anymore. You don't use warm water for the dough. Make sure you use cold water. Okay? Kami nga sa industry, we use ice chips pa eh. Okay? Kasi ayaw mo naman mag-rice yung dough, di ba? Paparice mo yun the following day. So, kukunin mo yung dough, use cold water, and then paka-mix, you put it in a bowl, yung ating oil bowl, right? And then tatakpan ng cling wrap. You put it in your fridge. And then you can let it stay in the fridge for up to 12 hours. And then you can proceed to the next morning when you wake up. Then you can start shaping it. And then putting it in the molds and allowing it to proof. Ayan.
There are some recipes that, like, if for example, tinatamad ka lang in the morning to shape, and konti lang naman, like if you're baking pandesal for your family, for example, what you can do, you can mix it, allow it to ferment. Yung fermentation, for those of you who are new to the term, siya yung first rising. So yung pag-breads, di ba dalawang rising natin? Yung unang rice, yung bulk pa siya. Tapos yung second rice, yung naka-individual na, naka-shape na. Yung first rising, that's called fermentation. And then the second rising is called proofing. So pwede mo na siyang i-ferment. Tapos pag umalsa na, you shape it, and then you put it in the trays, and then ipasok ka agad sa fridge. So that the next day, you just have to bake it. Ayan. Okay. So, last question. Meron akong cue card dito kasi meron ng time. 10:33 na. Alright. Sige, last question. Sino ang pipiliin natin? Sandali. Chef, paano po i-store ang cream cheese? Ilang days po ang shelf life? Well, cream cheese, when you buy cream cheese or butter or any cheese for that matter, meron naman siyang shelf life, di ba? Nakalagay doon, store refrigerated or keep refrigerated, and then it says kung kailan siya magbe-best before. Take note, kapag best before, hindi siya expiration date. Best before lang siya. The best siya kapag i-consume before that date. Pero kahit lumampas na yung date na yon, hindi ibig sabihin expired na siya. So when it says best before, then know what it means. So for cream cheeses, just make sure na pag binawasan ninyo, for example, again, open na siya for bacterial contamination. Up to 5 days, maybe the most is 7 days. Okay? Pero pag binawasan nyo ng ganyan, balutin ninyo ng cling wrap mabuti yung matitira, the leftover. And then, you put it in a container na sealed, airtight, para hindi siya mag-absorb ng ibang amoy ng ref. And then, you put it in your fridge. Okay? For about 5 days the most. Para ma-maintain pa rin yung fresh taste niya. Alright? So, Miss Grace, are you there? Okay, guys. My strawberry cream cake class was just uploaded today. So, if you haven't enrolled, I'm telling you, this is like the ultimate strawberry cream cake. It will make your eyes turn to the back of your head. So enroll. And then in about 2 weeks, we're launching naman another single recipe, which is, been requested by a lot of you. Yung 6-layer chocolate cake with old-fashioned cooked fudge frosting. So pasensya na kayo dun sa mga nag-aantay. Hindi namin madali because my art director is stuck in Cavite. He's been locked out or locked down. So we are going to smuggle them in next week. Yes, we'll smuggle them in. So, Miss Grace, I saw you. Where are you?
Hey, Chef, thank you so much for giving us this webinar. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us. We're so thankful po sa inyo for your time. Thank you for your time. And thank you for all of those who attended this webinar. So,
I'm so excited.
Yes, hopefully we'll come up with more webinars like this. Okay? Is that okay with you, Chef?
I'm in. Join ako dyan.
Okay.
Join ako dyan.
All right, that would be great. So for those who came in late, don't worry. This webinar is recorded, so I will send you a link through your email. So just give me time to download and upload the video. All right, and then for those of you who are streaming this live in Facebook, and you're not yet registered in our website, please do register in our website so you could get a replay of this class. Okay, so please register at www.thebailiwickacademy.com. Okay, so thank you so much, guys. It's 10:37 now in our time, and thank you all for your time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye po.
Bye.
Bye-bye.